Hello and welcome to lesson 2 of week 2. In this lesson, we are going to look at functions in JavaScript. My name is Mildred. Now, just as it is in other programming languages, a function is used to structure reusable and modular code, and we always want to write a function whenever we have a particular functionality that we are building into our system that we want to reuse over and over and over again. And so a function is like a block of code that we create, and it is designed to perform a specific task. In JavaScript, we declare a function using a function keyword like this, and then we provide a meaningful name for the function. Now, there are naming rules for functions. We don't want to have a name that has a special meaning in JavaScript, just like the naming rules that we have in creating variables. We have the same like that in functions, and so you want to have meaningful function names. And so we want to have a function, for instance, we say function greet, and then you have a pair of parentheses after the function name, and then immediately followed by a pair of curly brace. It is within this curly brace that you write your function definition. Now, when we call this function, it is going to execute whatever we have it doing in the curly brace. That is where we write the core functionality of that function. Alright, so we call this a function block. Whatever is within curly brace is a block, and whatever we define within this block, it's destroyed when it meets a return statement and we return to a calling program, or it does what it's supposed to do. But every time we need to use this function, we need to call the function. Now, we have another type of function that takes something we call parameters in the parentheses. You supply something called arguments when you call the function. And so let's define this function, and then we're going to look at the ones that take arguments. All right, so let's say we'll just use console.log for now, and then we say we want this function to just log in the console hello and welcome. So when we go to our web page and then we refresh it, we'll see our console will not have anything until we call this function. How do you call the function? You write the function name and then the pair of parentheses. And so when you come here, you have this displayed in the console here. All right, so we can now have a function that takes parameters in a definition. Let's say you are creating like a calculator app, and in this app you want to have a function that will be called when the user uses the addition and clicks on the equal sign. We want a function that will be called when it is subtraction, multiplication, and different things. So let's create a function for addition. So this function, we always want to take the parameters that are given by the user. So we'll call this function add, and let's say we just want this function to add two numbers. So say should add a and b. A and b is going to be the values that the user will supply, and then in a pair of curly brace we want to tell it what to do. Now, we use a return statement to return a value to the calling program, and what we want to return is a plus b. Okay, so we have the plus operator, the plus sign that we use to add two numbers, and so we want the user to supply numbers and we want it to return the addition of these numbers. And when we call the function and we say console.log and we say call the function within the parentheses here add, we have to supply two values. Let's say we supply 2 and 3, which means that it should give us 5, the addition of a and b. When we refresh our page here, 5 in the console. All right, so this is basically how we create functions. Functions are very powerful, and you need this skill even when you migrate to using different frameworks. Once you know JavaScript in the vanilla way, it will be easy for you to migrate through any JavaScript framework there is out there. All right, and so we can apply this to multiplication, and let's do the multiplication function, and let's use this to illustrate when we have functions that have default parameters. Let's say we want to create a function called multiply, and this function is going to take parameters in its definition. So once you put anything in these parentheses during the function definition, it is called a parameter. When you call the function and you supply values to it, it is called an argument. So we have a, b equal to, let's say b is 2. So we have this default value here for b, so that whenever we do not supply a value, it uses the value 2 for b. So when we say it should return a times b, it will return the multiplication to the calling program. So when we call this function, let's say console.log, and we are logging the multiply, and we multiply, let's say we supply the value of a 3, right? When we refresh our page, it will be 3 times 2, which is going to give us an error here, and we have an error because multiple is not defined. We have the function multiply, so we put the function name correctly and we refresh and we get 6. Now we have 6 because we supplied the value for A. B has a default value of 2, we didn't supply, but we can override this by saying B is 4 now, and so it will ignore this default value and it's going to do 4 times 3, which will give us 12 here. So when you want to have a default value, and where this is useful in having default values is when generally something is going to be working with one value and rarely ever change, and so you want the users to optionally supply a value or use a default value when that value is not supplied. Alright, so that is the advantage of this. So now that we know how to create a function, we can give ourselves certain tasks, like say let's write a function that will convert from kilograms to pounds. You have to know the formula for what you want to do. We know that whenever something is in kilogram and you want to convert it to another unit of measurement, you have to know how many kilograms make 1 unit of that. So we know that when we have 1 kilogram is equal to 2.2 pounds, right? So we can create a function and we call this function kg to pounds, like this, right? And so when we have this, we put kg here. So the user will have to supply the value in kilograms, and then we want the system to calculate it in pounds. And so what we return here is whatever the user supplies in kilogram multiply by 2.2 to give us the value in pounds, right? And so whenever we call this function, let's say console.log, we have kg to pounds, and then we supply, let's say we get 1 kilogram should give us 2.2 pounds. When we refresh and in the console we should see 2.2, and so when we have something that is 10 kilogram, we should get the value in pounds calculated for us there. So where this is useful is when you have a form in the front end and then you want to have the user enter in one unit and convert to other units of measurement. You can create applications that do all of this and make your system have the client-side function instead of server-side functions for this. Alright, so we can have a function. Instead of declaring a function like this, we can store a function in a variable. For instance, let's say the function add we created. We can have a variable add, right? And then we'll say add is equal to. So instead of having a value, the value of this variable is going to be a function. And so we're going to be having a, b like this. And then we'll still have a pair of parentheses and what it will return. So the return statement is always the last statement. And so we have a plus b. So we have this function stored in a variable. And so we can call this function. Let's print to the console. So we say console.log and then we call the function add, and in a pair of parentheses we supply the values, let's say 4 and 5, which will give us 9. Alright, so it's the same way we still call, only that this function is stored as a variable. There is the arrow function from ES6 that we can use, and you'll see the syntax most commonly that you can use. Let's say we have this function add like this. Let's create a function subtract, and let's say we use the function keyword and then we say subtract like this, and we want to supply, let's say 2 values, or now let's say 3 values, a, b, c, and we want to subtract the values that the user will supply, and what you want to return here is a minus b minus c, like that for the subtract function. You can call this function, but we can change this to use the arrow function or the arrow syntax to say let's store this in a variable and we'll say constant subtract. So now you see that when I declare my variables, and these are functions and objects, I use the const keyword, and that is the function of it. We use let for every other thing. We can use the const, and const for things that like objects and arrays and things that the value should not change. We use const. It's not a constant, it's just the syntax or the semantics that we use in JavaScript. So we do this like this, and we can now say equal to. So now we declare it as a variable. In a pair of parentheses we want to put the arguments a, b, c, and then we use the arrow function, equal an arrow like this, and instead of us now having the return statement, we use the arrow function and specify what we use in the pair of parentheses. This is another way of writing it, shorter syntax. This is how we use the arrow function in JavaScript. I'll comment this out, and I'm going to call this one and we'll call the other one, and then we'll see that they provide the same value. So we'll do console.log, and then what we want to get out of this is, let's say we use subtract and we're subtracting, let's say 9, 2 and 5 like this. So 9 minus 2 will give us 7 minus 5, 2. When we refresh we should get 2 here, and we want to repeat the same thing using the other one. So I'll comment this out, and then I'm going to use this beneath here, and then I will use this and say subtract this, and we'll hopefully get exactly the same number to see that it's exactly the same written in different way. So when you see an arrow function like this, it's just that this is a function stored in a variable. You don't use the function keyword when you use arrow function. You just, when you put the variable name equal to a pair of parentheses and all of your parameters, and then the arrow, and then what you put in a pair of curly brace. So this is the syntax for writing the arrow function. We have the anonymous function, that is a function that doesn't have a name, right? And every time we want to have a function inline, like let's say for instance I want to set timeout. So let's say I have set timeout. This is an inbuilt function, and now this function has no name, so I just use function like this and a pair of parentheses, and then within this I put my pair of curly brace, and I want it to log something in the console. So let's say console.log, and in this console I want it to say this runs, let's make it run after 2 seconds. It should delay, so this delays for 2 seconds before running, right? And then we put a comma here, and for 2 seconds that's 2000, right? So we want it to delay, so we have this function that is called within this. So it's an anonymous function, it has no name, right? And so it's used, you can use this inline within another statement. This is one example, but as we go deeper and as we start building our softwares, you will see how this is relevant. So when we refresh this, we wait 2 seconds and we see a value because it delayed before running, right? So this is an anonymous function. We also have functions that are we call IIFE, which are immediately invoked function expression. You will come across these terms, especially in job interviews, and after it is defined, it is executed almost right after. And so let's say we have a pair of parentheses, we define a function, and then whenever you define a function, you have a pair of parentheses, right? And then we have a pair of curly brace where we put the function definition. Let's say we just want to log in the console. So we say console.log, and then in a pair of quotes, we want to put what we are logging in the console. Let's say I want to put I run immediately. And so once you have this, after this end, you just put a pair of parentheses like this, and this function is going to run by itself without being invoked or without being called. It is run automatically. So when I refresh, it just says I run immediately. And so you can see here now that we did not do anything special after the function. So it is an immediately invoked function expression, and we're going to see applications of this. So the key takeaway for JavaScript function is that we have functions that take parameters, and when we call this function, we supply the argument, right, in the parentheses of the function definition. When we want to have default parameters, we specify all of the parameters and supply a value. We can have the ones that collect multiple arguments into an array. We'll look at that when we start looking at map and reduce and all of that. And then we have functions that have a return statement that returns a value to the calling program. And so this is where we end this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to look at how we handle errors in JavaScript. Thank you, and see you in the next lesson.